good morning. Welcome to the webinar, 15 Reasons Why Metal Parts Rust During Shipping and Storage. And I believe this is a special webinar for GKN. So I will stop for a moment and let Jeff introduce himself and talk to the group before I continue on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Short. I am the local Southeast rep for ARMOR. I've been in the GKN Newton plant. I've toured it with Michael. There are some opportunity areas there, so he kind of set this up to talk through the different reasons for rust and kind of an initial training. We've got tons more we can do if you find this beneficial, but we'll run through this for about 30 minutes. It'll be recorded so you can share it, and if you get something out of it, awesome. If you want more, we can do that as well. So to end, let me say thank you, Michael, for setting this up. This will be fantastic, and I hope it helps for everyone. Now, Kristen, our lovely host, will kick this off. She is way better than me at doing this, so I've gotten her to help, but I'll be here as well. So, Kristen, it's all you.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Jeff. Great. So if you've ever been on an ARMOR webinar, you know that we like to start with what we call Webinar 101. So what I want you to do is click on your computer screen. You'll see an orange box with a white arrow in it. You can use that and expand your control panel. About 2/3 of the way down, you'll see a line that says questions. And just to practice, all I want you to do is write yes in that question box. So about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see a line that says questions. All you need to do is write yes in there, and do not worry, only myself and only Jeff can see who's writing in that question box. But this is where you can communicate with Jeff and I throughout the 30 minutes today. You can ask questions in there. You can even jot down like a note that you want someone to answer later or Jeff to follow up on. So I see lots of yeses coming through, so we're good. And now I always like to make sure that you can see on your screen what I can see on my screen at the same time. So what you see on your screen right now, all I want you to do is in that question box we just practiced, just type a little description of it. There's really, as long as you can see something, no wrong answer. So you can see, yep, so we've got night, I love VCI. All right, it looks like we are on the same page. So I'm Kristen Moore. I am a project manager here at ARMOR Protective Packaging, and it's my voice, sometimes myself, that you're going to see for the next 30 minutes. And there's a picture of Jeff, who just introduced himself to you. He is your eradicator of rust for GKN. So again, anytime you have a question for Jeff, just type it right into that box. So for some of you this morning, you might be very familiar with ARMOR and what we do and how we work with you. But for others, you might be wondering, what do you do? Like, what do you sell? Like, what is all this about? So at ARMOR, we manufacture rust prevention and rust removal products. But we know that our purpose is to protect your brand, your part, and most importantly, it's your reputation. And how we do it is with VCI technology. So let me give you a little bit of background on rust and VCI. So when it comes to rust, you only need these three things in order to have rust. You need metal, you need air, and you need moisture. And if you have air and moisture, and then sometimes contamination around metal, you will have rust. And that's why rust prevention is so important. So I want to give you 4 different colors of rust. And the reason why we're sharing these with GKN today is because sometimes by looking at the color of the rust, you can figure out what is happening to the metal and what's causing that rust. So the first one that you're looking at, that's red rust. Red rust is the most common type of rust that's out there. It's the type of rust that's on a car or metal that's like laying out in a field. So in order for red rust to happen, that metal is exposed to a high amount of oxygen and moisture. So if you see red rust, which you probably have seen, that's the most common type of rust. But here's where things start to get a little bit more interesting for the industry that we're in. Now you might see brown rust. And if you're starting to see a lot of brown rust on your metal, what I want you to remember from this training is contamination. Brown rust is from contamination to that metal. So usually it's either fingerprints on metal or something people don't think about. It's solutions or part washers where the pH is off. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, what we mean by the pH being off. But brown rust equals contamination. Now, you might say, we don't have those, but our rust on our parts, it usually looks yellow. So if you're starting to see a lot of yellow rust, what you have is either parts that are by standing water, or in our industry, more common, parts that are washed but not fully dried before they're packaged. So if someone says to you, what is going on? What is all this yellow rust? Then you need to add some form of a desiccant to your packaging process because you really need to absorb that moisture from the packaging. And in a little bit, we'll talk about some of those options. And then sometimes on one single part, you can see multiple forms of corrosion. So if you look at your screen, on the up part of that picture, you see that brown rust. And then down on the bottom on my right-hand side, you can see that yellowish rust. And then there's a fourth color that can give you a clue to what's going on. And that is black rust. And if you're seeing a lot of black rust, you either have wet paper kind of tightly laying against that metal, or you could have poly that does not have VCI in it laying tightly against that metal. Because for order for black rust to form, the metal is exposed to a low amount of oxygen. And that's as deep as we're going to go when it comes to the science of rust. But if there's ever a time where you have a picture of a rusty part, you just have something that's happening in your process, and you want to send that to Jeff, and that is why we are eradicators of rust and rust experts. You can always do that. And if there's also a part that you're just thinking at and you want to jot it in that question box because you want him to follow up on it, feel free to do that. So after I talk about rust, I always am asked this question, why care about corrosion? And I think the best analogy I can give you is this. If you were working in a restaurant and somebody said to you, we work with food, so of course we have a little bit of food poisoning, you would never eat there again. Well, the same is true about corrosion and metal. Corrosion in metal does not have to be accepted in our industry. So just like you don't have to have a little bit of food poisoning, you don't have to have rust on your metal parts. Not only is it not great for your reputation, but the thing about rust is it costs companies a whole lot of money. And the best way I can describe the cost of rust is something we call the rust iceberg. So it's not what's sticking out of the water that sinks the ship. It's everything underneath the water that sinks the ship. And the same is true for rust. Everybody knows the traditional cost of rust, like the derusting and the extra parts and the extra shipping. But I think what everybody forgets about are all those hidden costs of rust. So we don't get into this today because we're talking about a different topic. But something that Jeff has that he can send out to your team is the real cost of rust video. It's about a 5 to 7 minute video that walks you through an 8D meeting, so a meeting where people are reviewing what happened in this situation. If you are the person who is constantly asked to lower the price of packaging, lower the price of packaging, lower the price of VCI, lower the price of rust prevention, then this is a video for you to watch. And it could also be a video that you send on to maybe a purchasing manager or a buyer. So again, if you want that video on the real cost of rust, type that in that question box and Jeff will send it out to you. But I do have good optimistic news for you, which is you can prevent rust. And as you know, and I know, there are multiple ways to prevent rust. But what we're going to talk about today is VCI packaging. So I just want to give you a couple slides on what is VCI in case you don't fully know what VCI is and how it works and how it prevents rust on metal. So VCI is represented right in the middle of your screen. And for order for VCI to work, it always needs a carrier. So in the picture that you're looking at, that carrier is craft paper. So in our factory, the VCI coats the craft paper. Sometimes people use the term in the industry, impregnates that craft paper. And then you can take your metal part, you can wrap it in that craft paper that has VCI in it, and it prevents rust. Now, before I tell you how, let me tell you another carrier. A common one is poly. So poly is extruded with VCI. So now, if you look at your screen, those little white dots, they represent VCI. And VCI is volatile, which just means that it wants to leave the carrier that it's in, and it's attracted to the metal. And it wants to put a barrier around that metal that keeps out what we talked about earlier. It keeps out the water and the contaminants and the oxygen, and it prevents rust from forming on that metal. So again, VCI just wants to leave whatever carrier it's in, it's attracted to the metal, and it gives it a barrier. Now you might be asking yourself, well, how thick is that barrier? We are talking nanotechnology. So ARMOR VCI is 4 to 6 nanometers thick. If you look at the right-hand side of your screen, a single sheet of paper is 100,000 nanometers thick. That's how clean and safe VCI is to use. So I'm going to hop off the screen right now, and we are going to get into the meat and the potatoes of what Jeff wanted me to cover this morning, which are the 15 reasons why parts rust during shipping and storage. But more importantly for your group, it's really, well, how do I avoid these 15 reasons? Like, what are the best practices you suggest so we do not have rust on our parts? So the first one is protection radius. And what I mean by protection radius is the improper positioning of VCI in packaging. So when it comes to VCI, what I want you to remember, what I want you to jot down, have on like in your notes, is that a good rule of thumb is that VCI, or your VCI packaging, is about 12 inches away or less from your metal. So the picture that you're looking at on your screen, that blue poly bag has VCI in it. You're going to put some parts in, and then because you want to be about every 12 inches or so, you're going to layer a piece of armor wrap, put some more parts in, and layer a piece of armor wrap. The good rule of thumb, good best practice, is have that VCI about 12 inches from your metal. The next one is water variability. What some people don't know until they take training is that chloride and chlorine levels in water sources can differ, and that can cause rust. So what we mean here is that if you have a water source to clean parts, we always say use deionized water, but we know that is not always practical, and a lot of organizations and our customers need to use a public water source. So here's our best practice for you, our piece of advice. Public water sources pH can vary, so have someone on the team log that pH. Log it, log the pH of that water, because then if you have a new rust issue that appears, you can go back to that log and see if there's a correlation between the water pH and a new rust issue that you're having, and not some other reason that you're having rust on your part. So log those pHs if you're using a public water source. Number 13, you guys are doing it. It is training. What we have found is an improper or lack of VCI training or education can cause rust. So things that Jeff has for you that he can get out to your team are our ARMOR VCI usage guides. We have easy to follow usage guides. We have simple videos. VCI is pretty common sense, but we want to make sure that people who are in the field working day in and day out with the VCI understands how it works, understand that VCI works best in an enclosed space. So if you want usage guides, if you want information, if you want, when we're allowed to be together in person, if you want in-person training for your teams, always ask that to Jeff. All right, reason number 12. We will see a lot of rust because people are still using oil. And we know now that rust preventative oils are not the best solution for preventing rust. We know that RP oils are the traditional method of preventing rust and corrosion. However, they are messy and they are labor intensive and they are bad for the environment. They are bad for your employees and they are less effective than a good VCI product when it comes to preventing rust. So I would say this to you right now, if you think about your situation, what you're involved in, if there are any groups that are still using RP oils, speak with Jeff about how do you transition from an RP oil to a VCI solution with VCI packaging. All right, reason number 11 why we see rust. And I just find this reason fascinating. It's that if metal comes into contact with wood, paper, or corrugated surfaces that do not contain VCI, it can cause rust. So, forestry-based products, so again, wood, paper, the boxes, corrugated surfaces, they contain everything that causes rust. They contain moisture, they contain contaminants, they contain acids, they contain chlorides, and all of that can cause rust. Now, I have a little note that you might want to jot down, a best practice or a clue. A clue to you that rust might be happening from this situation is that some of the parts in your shipment are rusty and some aren't. And then you can compare them to, oh, those parts are the parts that are touching some form of a forestry-based product. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, we're saying, no. Though you can tell that the metal is laying right on those boxes, and then someone took a bag, maybe a VCI bag, and they put it around the outside of it, thinking that that would cause rust prevention. But what you want to do in this situation is the picture on the right, which is you want to make sure your products that have VCI in them are next to the metal and in between the metal and those boxes and pallets. And that is reason number 11. All right, reason number 10 is the improper amount or not using enough VCI packaging and products. So I have these two pictures on the screen because while the picture on the left can work, I mean, you can put a VCI bag around a part, it's not best practice. Instead of the picture that you're looking at, a better choice would be a bonnet, which is what reminds me of a shower cap. So you can make an enclosed space around the metal. And then the picture on the right I put on the webinar because this one's interesting for training. Not everybody knows this, but the cylinder shape, because the way it's made, the way the green boundaries are exposed, metal in that shape is more likely to rust than the same metal, just in a different shape. So if a lot of your parts have that cylinder shape, you want to make sure that you're using the proper amount of VCI to protect them. In this picture, what would have been great is if they would have either added a VCI Smarty Pack or maybe added some Armor wrap or craft paper, like right down to each one of those cylinders. And that can help prevent rust. All right, reason number 9 is poor quality VCI. Not all VCI is the same. I could say that 100 times. Not all VCI is the same. We each have our own labs, our own technology. We understand how our VCI works compared to other VCIs in the market. We understand how our VCI works on specific metals. So if you ever want more information about our VCI compared to other VCIs, ask that to Jeff. And then I'm going to leave you with this analogy when it comes to not all VCIs are the same. I'm buying a used car. I call up the used car dealership. The person on the other end of the phone says, oh yeah, I've got the car that you want, and I even put new tires on it. And I go and I buy those tires, or I go buy the car, and I drive off, and about 15,000 miles later, those tire treads are shot. And in that moment, I realized, there's a difference between a name brand tire and just a generic tire. And the same thing is true about VCI. Not all VCI is the same. All right, something that you want to keep in mind when you're working with metal is the temperature. So failure to maintain proper temperature for metal parts. And this is pretty straightforward. I think most of us in this industry know that for every 10 degrees Celsius, you have an increase in temperature, corrosion rates can double. So if you look around at your plant, we say package parts in areas away from dock doors, away from other parts in the plant that experience temperature swings, away from heat treating areas. And then here's another little tidbit of information you could jot down. If you're bringing parts into your plant and those parts are already in VCI packaging, if your process allows it, allow them to acclimate to the temperature of your plant before you remove that VCI packaging. All right, reason number 7 is contamination, leaving metal parts uncovered or unprotected. We have in this picture no and yes. And while that yes picture is not a bag that's fully enclosed around the part, what it is doing is protecting an in-process part that's just waiting for its next step. And the reason that we say do this is because there's so many contaminants in plants people don't even think about. For example, forklift exhaust that can cause rust. So if possible, while parts are just sitting in a plant waiting for that secondary operation, or they're in queue for additional machinery or drilling, then if they're waiting to be packaged, if it's possible, cover them so they don't have any other contaminants on them that can cause rust. All right, reason number 6, we are back to that pH level. As I mentioned earlier, pH is incredibly important when it comes to preventing rust, and that we want to make sure that you have the proper pH levels and titration. So the lab gave me this information, and then they always give me the little disclaimer, which is check with your own proper usage. But we say for ferrous metal parts, a pH level of at least 9.0 should be maintained. And for non-ferrous metal parts, such as copper and alloys, brass and bronze, a pH level of 7 to 7.5 should be maintained. But again, always check with your in-process fluid suppliers for proper usage. And again, it's just the idea that we want you to remember to regularly check and correct pH levels of all your cleaning parts and solutions that come into contact with your metal. All right, reason number 5 is improper usage. Similar to the reason earlier, usage is important when it comes to VCI. And the 2 things that we want you to take away from this is VCI works best when it's fully closed. So that picture on the left is incorrect. We want to make sure that bag is fully closed. And the picture on the right is what we talked about earlier. We want to make sure that VCI is in between metal and any forestry-based products. All right, reason number 4, similar to temperature, but we're talking about now is condensation. And everybody thinks about condensation in the environment that they're working in, but sometimes people forget about the condensation that we can make inside of our packaging solutions. So what you're looking at right now on your screen are returnable trays. Those returnable trays are all stacked together. And then if you look right in the middle of your screen, what you see are a bunch of handholds that are stacked all on top of each other. And they make something that we call in the industry the chimney effect. So then inside of packaging, you have air that's flowing up and down in those handholds. The temperature's rising and falling. It's causing condensation, which causes moisture, which then causes rust. So if you have something that looks like this, or the way that your packaging is designed, you have what looks like a chimney, you could then have the chimney effect. So the best way to get rid of the chimney effect inside of packaging is to break the airflow. So if you look real close at your screen, you can see that Armor wrap is lined in between each one of those returnable trays. I've seen customers do that. I've also seen people take Armor wrap and just shove it right down in to try and break that chimney effect. All right, reason number 3 is handling, touching metal parts with bare hands. There is that brown rust I talked about earlier that comes from contamination. Now, an interesting fact about fingerprints is that we know women's hands are more acidic than men's hands. So sometimes our customers will say to us, we have a new rust issue, and what they really have is a new person who's touching those metal parts. So we say make sure everybody who's working with metal wears gloves and that those gloves are clean, because a pair of dirty gloves can be worse than clean hands. All right, reason number 2 is that rinse and dry process. This is a big one. As I mentioned earlier, we have a solution if you have a lot of yellow rust. So again, if you have yellow rust, you have a moisture problem, and you need to absorb that moisture from your packaging. So we have, of course, desiccant, but right now, desiccant is just tough to come by. So we also have another solution if desiccant is something that you're struggling to find, which is an ARMOR Smarty Pack. It is a combination pack of both VCI that's emitted from the pack in order to prevent rust and desiccant, which can absorb that moisture. So if you want to learn more about what is this Smarty Pack, what type of desiccant do you use because it's not clay, then you can always reach out to Jeff, or you can even type in that question box, send me the cell sheet on Smarty Pack, or just cell sheet on Smarty Pack, and he will get that information right over to you. And then reason number 1, our last reason, and I would say we could kind of sum up the entire information into this reason, is dirty conditions. Dirty conditions in your plants can cause rust. Everything from dirty gloves to dirty solutions to fork loft exist, and then to one more that I haven't talked about yet, which is on the left-hand side of your screen, which is something we call swarf. So if you're familiar with sawdust, a piece of wood gets cut, sawdust floats up in the air and lands everywhere. The same thing happens with metal. When you work with metal, metal has a carbon dust. That carbon dust can land everywhere, and that carbon dust is called swarf. But the tricky little thing about swarf is that when it lands on other metal, it likes to make a galvanic corrosion cell, which is just a fancy way of saying it likes to cause more rust. You want to make sure those parts are covered, those gloves are clean, and those part washers or solutions have the correct pH. All this information I shared is on our ARMOR website, and then because this is a personalized webinar to your group, you have Jeff to be able to reach out to. So there's Jeff, there's the rest of our team, but right now Jeff is your guy, and then I will turn it back over to him. So go ahead, Jeff, if you've got any questions that you've seen come through on this webinar, take them away.
So we haven't had any major questions, but one thing I'd like to talk about is we covered a lot of information. There are a lot of different ways to prevent rust. And one of the things I caution companies when doing this training is don't try to do all of these at once. If any of these resonated with you, or if you saw one or maybe two that stood out that you know is happening in your plant, make small changes. Try to fix one or two areas at a time. Make sure that's working correctly instead of saying, oh, we've got 5, 6, 7 of these. We need to fix them all. I would caution against that. Make small changes, fix the big problem area or low-hanging fruit, and then kind of make those small adjustments to get your rust under control. Like I said, I've been through the plant with Michael. There are a few of these that stood out to me, but I hope this was beneficial just to kind of get the initial, A, what is VCI, B, how can we help, and then the overall what or where do we see corrosion happening in plants, to kind of get your mind wrapped around how corrosion starts and how it can really affect your plant. So, but that is it. That is the training. It's almost right at 30 minutes. If this was beneficial, let Michael know, let me know, reach out any point in time. If you have questions, reach out, phone, email, whatever we can do to help. We would love to.
And on my end, I want to add saying thank you. When I close the webinar out, a survey does pop up. 1's the lowest, 5's the highest. If you have a couple minutes, I think there's 5 questions. I'd love to hear your feedback. That's also a great spot to write any more questions that you have for Jeff or more topics that you want to learn about. We have a whole bunch of webinars that we can talk with you about. But for myself and from Jeff, thanks for taking 30 minutes with us today. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.